Hello, everyone. Hopefully you can all see the screen. Great. So my talk today, is engaging students through interactive learning. Now, the focus is going to be primarily on developmental psychology, the class I have the most familiarity with, but hopefully there are applications to other classes as well. The first thing I wanted to say is that today's students do definitely respond to interactive learning. They seem to expect it, and so it's definitely a fair season or open season, I guess, for using it. I use many traditional techniques. I wanted to give you a few examples before getting to the main centerpiece of my discussion. So some of the traditional ones are posing questions to the group. That's a tried and true. There are good and poor ways. There are better ways to do that. Probably the best thing to remember in posing questions to the group is to listen to the person's question, and then the most common mistake I've seen people make is answering that person rather than answering the class as a whole. So, when you pose a question and then someone answers, don't get into a private conversation with that person. Kind of remember that the audience as a whole needs to be interested in your answer. So look around, monitor their involvement. And there are other things that we could discuss later about sort of group interactions. Another one that really catches most people's attention, makes the students look up from their screens or notes, are short videos of children. Usually the children are cute, and you don't want these to go on too long or be too funny because they can be distracting, but they make a point. So they usually generate a lot of questions or responses from students, and they can lead into a lecture topic. Another one is case studies. Students always enjoy that more than or at least as a break from research studies. So a case study typically is something that, again, makes a point or brings up a discussion issue. And it'll usually be something interesting that, a classic case study or even a personal story. Those often work very well because students can see the connection with, your life and sometimes their life as well. Another classic one that's in all the books about teaching is called Pair and Share, kind of a catchy title. Here you would pose a question, and normally what happens when you pose a question in the classroom is the usual suspects respond. People's hands go up, and it's usually the same people. What Pair and Share does is you ask every student to turn to their seatmate or two. It could be 3 people, and respond to the question that you just asked. So you might ask something like, in adolescence, did you have experiences of being bullied verbally or whatever? And then they could share that with each other, or maybe a friend had been bullied. And usually you get very animated conversation. Today's students love talking to each other. I've noticed that. I'm sure that's true everywhere. And you have to really, stop it after a while and say, okay, let's hear some of the great things that you came up with. And not only does that get everyone talking, but it sometimes leads to people raising their hands who, who normally would not. And in particular, if you see a really animated discussion or overhear a good discussion, you can actually point to someone and say, would you like to share that? And because they've just talked about it, they might feel more comfortable speaking out in class. So I use that a lot. I have to keep reminding myself to do that, especially when you ask a question, everyone sits there and doesn't respond. If you were to ask the same question and say, share that with your neighbor, all of a sudden you see, tons of interaction going on. So that's a really good technique. Another one that's perhaps more thoughtful is a 3-minute essay, and there are various versions you can do of that. The most famous one is the muddiest point, where you ask people, after about a 20-minute lecture, or sometimes at the end of class, to write down what was the most unclear or muddiest thing that you heard today. It could be because the speaker, hopefully not, but the speaker was unclear, and that does happen. But also it could just be because the student doesn't understand a concept, or maybe thinks there's something contradictory. So these are written, and you could have the students respond afterwards. Did someone have really compelling one they'd like to share? Or you could just collect these and read them as an instructor to see what are the most common areas that people have confusions on in your lecture, and you could even clear those up with a follow-up lecture or putting something online. Another one I really like is the personal connection, where you ask the student, okay, in what way did you feel personally connected to the last topic that we were sharing over the last 20 minutes or so? And you'll get an amazing variety of things there. A lot of them, again, you could have the students share in class, or you could use them later, anonymously if you think the student wouldn't be embarrassed, as great examples to use in future lectures. And so I wanted to turn to another topic, which is engaging students outside of class. It's important these days not only to engage them in class, but also outside class. And there are a variety of traditional techniques here too. One that publishers are really using quite actively now are self-paced online study guides. Almost every major textbook comes with this, and they're becoming more and more sophisticated. Students like them. It allows them to kind of forces them sort of to go through and learn the material and quiz themselves, and there are often interactive exercises there where the program can tell the student what area they need more work on based on how they answered questions. And it can also be used, the instructor can also monitor it or have the students turn in assignments. So those are a great outside of class aid. A second old traditional one is study buddies or study groups. You can just encourage those as an instructor, or just ask, how many people are in a study group, who wants to be in one, and you could match people up. Or you could actually assign. I have known people who have assigned study buddies, and you three are working together, and then switch it out. Maybe after a 1/4 of the class. A third one in developmental is child observation. Here you have the students go out and observe a baby or a preschooler, or interview an older child, or even give a test like a Piaget's classic conservation test. And that students really love that. By the time they get out and actually do it, they rave about that, and it really it's a great experience, sort of one-off experience for them working with the child. Now that kind of is the departure point for my main topic here, and it led me to create an interactive aid for study and for classroom involvement. And that was the limitations of observing children. I found over the years that it was difficult to arrange for students and for me to find schools that would allow 150 students to troop through observing children and that sort of thing. Also, it's a small sample of behavior. You're depending on the child doing something interesting or something that pertains to the class. And you can make recommendations, that guide the students, but sometimes the kids just don't act the way the students were expecting. So, or it's a not representative sample of behavior, small sample. The other kind of complaint I've had over the years is that students don't get a comprehensive view. They can't see children of different ages or different genders or different individual differences. So they really just see one example of behavior. And they don't know what a parent would know. And that might seem like a strange thing to say. Why should they know that? But when I've had students in class who were parents or I've had them, every semester I have one or two, they usually are the most engaged, most interactive. They nod their heads, when you're saying things, and you go, what, did your child do that? And they come up with great examples. So I've often sort of dreamed about in the past, what if all my students could know what a parent would know, what I know as a parent of 3 children? I would make the class so much easier to teach. So I was mulling that over, and one evening I was in a grocery store and I saw a high school student. Bear with me a minute while I tell this story. I saw a high school student come in, and she had one of these electronic dolls that high schools pass out to students to give them a feeling of responsibility for caring for a child. And of course, it's supposed to limit teenage pregnancies, and it works both ways with males and females. And in thinking, wow, I really don't want to have one of these yet. It's really a hassle, and that's the point of it. But I was looking at it kind of differently. I was thinking, wow, what if students could raise a child, in the process of doing a developmental psychology class? That personal experience would be very engaging. What if they could do it online, or if it could be a simulation? And so I got this idea and kept, thinking about it for a long time, just coming back, and I wonder if I can do this. So one day I mentioned it to one of my graduate students, and she said, well, I know a great programmer who's a web designer who can actually, tell you whether that's possible. And to make a long story short, I hooked up with a programmer who, Mike Radford was his name, who was very good at just saying, sure, oh yeah, we can do that. We can make it interactive. We can make it grow. We can simulate child development. So over the years, and with Pearson's help, we've published a couple of programs. One is called MyVirtualChild. It's an interactive simulation of child development. And I want to use this, I want to talk about it as a sort of example of an out-of-class and in-class process of engagement with students. And if you're thinking, well, that's not relevant to me, I don't teach developmental psychology, you could think of an analogy. As I'm going through this, you might think about, well, how could I involve my students in an extended simulation of principles of social psychology or abnormal psychology? Use your imagination, but something that's an extended involving project. And maybe we can talk about that at the end if you have some ideas. So just to give a quick overview, I want to kind of give you a flavor for what the program is like, so that I can then talk about all the various ways in which I think it enhances student engagement. So the way it starts, the student logs on and they have an ID and all of that, and they're given a personality questionnaire that's supposed to be tapping into what they were like at the end of high school. Next, they choose their child's appearance, and I'll be showing you examples of all of these things. Then their child is born. Every child, is a simulated child, of course, and they have semi-random traits, which means they're like values in the personality questionnaire, so they're somewhat like the user, the parent, we'll call them from now on, and that's parent with quotes, of course. And they're also somewhat random, so they're programmed to be like real children. They're not exactly like you, and they could come up with some surprising personality or ability traits. Next, they get a whole series of parenting questions, and that's really the heart of the program. It's a series of questions posed to them in stories saying, you're a parent now, what would you do about this? Your child is this age, what would you do about this behavior? They also hear about milestones in the child's development, such as walking or learning to talk. And then random events occur in the child's life, sometimes in the family's life, like a certain percentage get divorced in the course of the program, and there are various accidental things that happen. Each child has a unique path, so they follow their own unique path. It's kind of based on their personality traits, certain random events, and there are also certain similarities across children. Every so often, they get realistic reports. So they'll hear about someone who screened their child for kindergarten, or a report card, or even a psychologist at one point comes on and tests their child, and they see the scores. And they also get reflective questions. Every so often in the program, questions pop up which can be used to reflect on the material in the program and then also in the textbook. And that's where the links with the textbook are made. So let's look at some examples of how this program works, just so you can get a feel for how involving it is, hopefully. So here's the personality questionnaire. And they just run through this. There are 20 questions, and it sort of identifies personality traits among that user. They get to choose how their child appears. There are 5 different general appearances, and then they can fine-tune the hair color, the eye color, and the skin tone. So it's sort of like some of these dolls that you can buy that look exactly like the child or somewhat like the child. And then congratulations, your child is born. I chose to name this child Liza. I don't know why, just like that name at the moment. And then it goes through the parenting questions. So one of the key ones that there's a lot of developmental research on is breastfeeding. It's just one question. You answer it yes or no or maybe. But then the students could think about that. Why would I choose that? And you can ask them that in class. Here's a slightly older, 8 months question where it's saying, okay, this is a typical situation. Your child is fearful around strangers. What would be your typical response? So as a parent, what would you do? Would you be really protective? Would you, kind of be forceful and get your child to make friends with that person? Would you ignore it because it's basically a normal reaction for an 8-month-old? What would you do? And then depending on the choices that you make gradually through the program, it can slowly alter your child's personality traits, social competence, verbal ability, and so forth. Developmental milestones. This one at 12 months is kind of subtle. It says, college friend of yours speaks Mandarin, visits, and the child tried to imitate the Mandarin words, but they sounded more like English than Chinese. And this is reflecting something that happens in development between 6 and 12 months, where the child actually becomes better able to hear speech from their own language and not from a non-native language. And so this is, has some research that you could tie it into. Here's one of the random events. You receive an advancement and a pay raise. Sounds kind of like Monopoly or the game of life, but some of these are, there's a lot of different random events. Unique developmental path. Every child can vary somewhat. So in this case, I'm giving an example of how Liza, who's now 18 months, is a little bit slow in vocabulary and language development. And you're asked, what could you do? Again, based on research, the students are meant to think about, what does the research say would be the best way to stimulate language development. So you might look through there, and probably number 1 is not a good choice. Number 2, probably okay, but number 3 probably best of all, because you're asking the question and then the child has to formulate some sort of answer. So that probably number 2 and number 3 would both work really well. And you can talk about these in class, or students can reflect on them on their own. Then here's an example of a realistic individualized report, which the students get every so often. This is the first one they get. They visit a pediatrician. So they're meant to be, sort of things that might really happen. And then what the program does is it takes your child's current characteristics and plugs them into the report. So your child is physically healthy. Notice she's cautious around new people. So she is a little bit shy, actually. She's typical in her emotional reactions. She's a little behind in gross and fine motor skills. So it gives you a customized report students, become very involved with that, thinking, wow, that really ties in with what I was hearing about my child, and what can I do to sort of improve my child's motor development. And then the reflective questions, here's an example of the first set. They come up at 8 months, 18 months, so forth. So they just ask the student to think back to what they've experienced in the program, and then also tie into material like the temperamental styles. That's a very common one in textbooks. And then at the bottom you can just see a question about attachment, which of course is one of the most common topics in infant development. So outcomes, how does the program work, or what's the effect on the students? I don't have a formal evaluation. I haven't run a class in which I used VirtualChild and one in which I didn't. As a sort of experimentalist at heart, I realized that would not be a well-designed study because there'd be too many things different. I would need to vary only one thing to see if there was an effect. And using a program like this changes a lot of things. It changes the written assignments. The students aren't going out and observing children. So there's a variety of differences. But I have a lot of informal, sort of qualitative evaluations. I've read hundreds of student reports or evaluations of the course, and they report that they're highly engaged with the program and the course content. And you can see in their reports that they dig into the material, they come up with great answers to the questions, it reflects their learning, and there's often some very creative, surprising things that they can report. They also report that they become attached to their child, show pride. They even talk about their child with each other. I've heard several examples of students in a dorm raising a child with their roommates. So the roommates say, "What are you doing there?" And then they join in and advise the student parent on what to do. So I've had many students come to me and say, "My roommates want to do it too." I weave it into lectures and ask them to answer questions about it in class. Not too much because they've done it on their own, and everyone's at different points in the program usually. But you can hold sort of sessions every once in a while. So I call them parent forums, where I have them talk to each other as parents would do about their children, kind of sharing what happened and problems they're having and so forth with each other, and then advising each other. And that's fun to do every once in a while. Here's a quote that's typical of student reactions. "My child was very similar to me as a child, and I saw much of my own childhood during this program. It was interesting because I was in the parent's perspective, and I finally understood, to an extent, what my parents thought and felt during my childhood." I've made a note to save that one and give it to parents of students just so that they could say, "Wow, my child really appreciates what I did." Okay, levels of engagement. Here's what I want to talk about, use this as a tool to talk about engagement. Something like this could be a self-contained activity where you just allow the students to do it on their own. It's engaging enough. They answer questions. They have to think about it, hopefully. They don't just respond randomly. They have to answer questions, in addition to just multiple choice. They have to actually write answers to questions. So it's very engaging just by itself. You can also up the level of engagement by discussing individual questions in class. So you can put it up on the screen, particularly challenging or interesting questions that tie into the subject matter. You could say, well, what did everyone answer to this, and why, and what's the research behind this? So it can lead to just one question. Just say the breastfeeding question, for example, could lead into a whole discussion of pros and cons of breastfeeding. Mostly pros, the research shows. You can discuss reflective questions in class, so those questions about attachment or about temperament. You can have the students compare their children's temperaments and discuss those. You can also ask the class, and I've done this more recently, to raise children using different parenting techniques. So I'll have the students sign up to be a very strict parent or a very permissive parent. Most of them will be the sort of modal parent that the textbooks recommend, which is called authoritative, where you're going to be warm but also provide structure to the child. And then when we have our permissive parents and our sort of warm parents, and then we have our really strict parents, we can look at the outcomes. And some of the students really enjoy doing that and seeing that, wow, if I'm a permissive parent, my child has some poor outcomes at the end. If I'm a strict parent, my child's outcomes aren't as poor, but my child doesn't like me so much, and my child's showing some signs of anxiety. So it kind of taps into the research on this. You can have a student raise 2 children and vary either the genes or the environment. So they could input different personality traits at the beginning to see what happens. Or in raising the child, they could input the same personality traits. Of course, they're going to get 2 somewhat random children, just like any 2 siblings, but they could try to impose the same environment on those 2 children. And what they'll see, actually, in one of the lessons of developmental psychology, is you can't do that. You can't treat 2 different children exactly the same because they're active and dynamically interacting with you, and they will evoke different responses from the parent. So it's very useful in getting at some of the core issues of developmental psychology. And then finally, you can discuss how the simulation differs from real children. For example, many students will say, this isn't like my family at all. You know, my parents raised me differently. My parents were traditional from a particular ethnic group or cultural group. And that, you know, is great. There are a couple of reflective questions about those things in the program. But also it's just great as a classroom discussion to bring up and say, well, how is your culture different? You know, and you can get a discussion going among different people actually from, say, the same general cultural group. So among, say, students from Asian American students, there might be differences from people from different countries. Finally, VirtualChild is still developing, and so are my classroom techniques. I learn something every time I talk to a colleague about teaching or when I observe a class. And just sort of as a reference here, there's some great books I've read recently that talk about interactive teaching techniques. One by Nielsen, Teaching at Its Best, and the old classic, Mikichi's Teaching Tips. So I highly recommend those. Nice short articles on interesting topics. And the techniques can be immediately used in the classroom.
So Frank, the first question is, there is already so much to cover in a lifespan development course and even child development. Did you have to cut things out when you started using MyVirtualLife?
Well, yes. The thing I cut out was the child observations. They were giving me a lot of trouble. I was having preschools that, you know, were canceling and worried about, you know, student germs and that sort of thing. And so I didn't miss those so much. I mean, I always encourage students to go out and observe children, but by taking that out, I think that was the equivalent. I had 3 observations, the equivalent amount of time. And the other thing is that you don't have to be highly involved in using it. You can just assign it as an out-of-class assignment, and you can also tell the students, answer half of the reflective questions, or, you know, you can kind of raise or lower the amount of involvement that you have with it. So, you know, I think it returns a lot, so I don't miss the things that I've had to give up.
Great. And I think this next question is actually very similar, but I'll read it anyway just in case. And the question is, my developmental text is extensive and students complain. How do you handle the factor of students getting overwhelmed with reading the book and all the VirtualChild pieces?
Yeah. I think that is slightly different. I think today's textbooks, there's a lot to cover. It's an enormous field. I'm writing a draft of a textbook now, so you don't have to tell me that. There's a lot to cover. And my approach to that actually is to use a study guide. So I'll tell students, you know what, there's a lot of material in this textbook. Here are the things I want you to focus on. And you can do that through an online study guide. I use actually my own study guide with sort of essay-type questions where I have them about the lecture too. I say, these are the things I want you to focus on, write answers to these questions, and go and find the material in the textbook. So that actually, I'll encourage them to use the textbook as a resource and not just to read it and try and pull everything out and memorize everything. So textbooks should be resources. I mean, they should be readable, of course, but they're just, like you say, pretty overwhelming. So that's my way of dealing with that.
Great, thanks. So next question is, although I understand the concept of the program, it seems it can only go so far in understanding a child. Humans are such complex species. How does this program come close to correlation of an actual human?
Yeah, I think you have to always keep in mind it's a simulation, and it's not culturally diverse. It doesn't depict, for example, different children growing up in different cultures. It doesn't even depict a child growing up into whatever imaginary culture I had in mind when I wrote it. It's kind of a combination of different people's experiences. So you always have to say that it's a learning exercise. It's meant to stimulate thought, and some of the thoughts could be, well, how are real children different from the virtual child? And what would you do in an actual situation where a child was shy? And that can lead into, it's meant to be engaging, right? And so that could engage students a lot. You could say, well, I wasn't able to do this in the program, but I do all sorts of things to help my child's language development, or to help my child become less shy, or shyness is okay. Here's a way of dealing with it. So, it could prompt a lot of discussions.
Great, thanks. Next question is, which domains of development are covered in MyVirtualChild?
It covers a little bit of, well, all of them really, but its focus is on social and emotional development. There are questions on language, you noticed, on cognition, and on physical development and health. But I'd say probably 2/3 of the questions are social and emotional development. And the reason I did that is I think those are more engaging, and you can talk about them in terms of the other areas. For example, cognitive development is important to children's understanding of other people and their ability to relate to peers. So it sort of underlies, and of course brain maturation, biological aspects of development underlie any social behavior or any social situation. So I use the social situations kind of as a point, departure point, but that is the main focus.
Okay, great. Next question is, do you assign a grade to your students for completing the program, and how can you tell if a student is actually doing the work?
There's an online monitoring system that is set up now where the instructor can see how far along the students are in the program, how many questions they've answered, and also the reflective questions. You notice there were little boxes. The students can write answers in there, and then those can be transmitted to the instructor. What I do is have the students compile all those questions, or actually they select from them and compile these short reports, about 3 to 4 pages. And they're easy to write because the student just, has basically lived with the child running the program, and so all they have to do is write examples. And so by looking at those reports, you can see how involved the student was. They aren't reports that you could fake. You can tell if a student just made something up. And I do grade that. I grade the reports based on how well composed they are and how well they use the content in the course. So they don't get a grade for doing it per se, but for doing the reports.
Thanks. Next question is, what kinds of feedback have you received from students? So is there a difference with male versus female students and students who are parents versus non-parents?
Yeah, it's kind of interesting. On the male-female, I've been just continually surprised how involved the guys get. You'd naturally expect the female students to be involved, and they are, to varying degrees. But last semester there was a group of guys who were friends and sat together in the class, and they were talking very animatedly during one of our discussions, and I said, "Is this sort of like a fathers, meeting of fathers?" And they said, "Oh yeah, we're talking about how good at sports our kids are, and actually, how we're going to help our kids do well in school." And they may have been kidding. I don't know if that's what they were actually talking about, but they did seem very involved. And as far as parents go, actually, if you've raised a real child, I find that people are a little bit resistant to going through the program. It's better for people who haven't raised a child. And I think maybe it's just because it reminds them of things that they, staying up late at night and, going through what they've already gone through with the child. So they see it from a professional point of view. They understand it. But student parents, I find, are less enthusiastic about it than the students who aren't a parent yet. It's interesting. I don't know why that is. Something I'll have to probe into.
Great. And so the next question is, so my virtual child goes from birth through the end of adolescence chronologically, but how might this work, A, in a topically organized child development course? Then also, this person's wondering if there are suggestions and if you could use it for an intro psych course.
Okay. So in a topical course, I've heard from various people, some people will just assign it in the background and just say, you're the student, you figure out how this relates. And that can work, it adds a chronological component to a topical course, which, often instructors will say, I like the topical approach, but I wish they could also get a feeling for what a 4-year-old is like or what a baby is like. So the program can serve that purpose. I've heard people tell me that. But the most logical place to assign it is in the section of the topical course where you've moved on to social and emotional development. So as you start to talk about, infants and attachment, and then you move into parent-child relations and usually peers, that's next. That section, about 5-week section of the class, is the most logical place to do it. And then as far as an intro course, I don't think that I would recommend that because the developmental portion of the course is about 2 weeks. So and that's the whole lifespan. So I don't see this as working that well in an intro class. It might work in a parenting class. I've seen people use it for that purpose. Marriage and family, course or a parenting class.